Welcome to another podcast here on Rob's Words of Encouragement. I'm Rob Brannon, and today we're going to discuss the Book of Ecclesiastes. And here on our podcast, we deal with hot topics, things that are happening that are pressing, that really cause us to think and stop and ask ourselves, what's really being said here? What's going on? Or how should we react to that? And always from a biblical worldview. Over these years, and often many of you come to me with pressing questions. I'm glad you do. And that's one reason I'm doing the podcast, is I want to enlarge the audience of those that benefit not just from what I have to say, but your good questions, because they really are good questions. And thank you for sending them my way. And a question that has come to me is, who wrote the Book of Ecclesiastes? There are a lot of new thoughts out there. And I would like to first start out by reading a quote from Thomas C. Oden. And Thomas Oden was a liberal theologian and a socialist, but in the 1970s had a significant shift in his beliefs. And so he made a shift to evangelical classical Christianity, if you will. Listen to this quote from him, that he was once asked, what would you put on your tombstone? And this is what he said, quote, "He made no new contribution to theology." I love this. I actually heard this from Philip de Courcy. He's one of my favorite preachers from Northern Ireland. I listen to him almost every day. And he quoted Thomas, and this really got my attention. He made no new contribution to theology. That's what he wanted on his tombstone. What would you want on your tombstone? Comment below. I'd like to hear and interact with you on that. That's not what I would say. For sure, I would not have said that. But this is a very powerful statement from someone who made a shift from liberal theology to conservative. Why would I like a tombstone that says of a theologian, I had no new contribution to theology? The reason being, it's the one thing I hate to innovate, that we should all hate to innovate, and that's theology, to come up with new ideas. Because from the beginning, when we received the gospel, when the word was inspired, it's unchangeable. The Apostle Paul, Peter, Moses, all this theology that's come to us over the years, the meaning has always been the same. And the challenge is not coming up with new theology. It's interpretation. It's called hermeneutics. We'll discuss that in a minute. MacArthur's Study Bible, this is what he says about the authorship of the Book of Ecclesiastes. The autobiographical profile of the book's author, that is Ecclesiastes, unmistakably points to Solomon. Evidence abounds, such as, number one, the titles fit Solomon. Okay, in verse 1:1 of Ecclesiastes, it says, quote, "He's the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Fits Solomon. He's the son of David, was king of Jerusalem. And king over Israel and Jerusalem, it says in chapter 1, verse 12 and 2. The author's moral odyssey chronicles Solomon's life. If you read 1 Kings 2, chapter 2 through 11, it chronicles his life. It fits. And Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and you read in Ecclesiastes about his explanation of having all the women he wanted, all the gold, all the horses, everything. Now, next, you have number 3, the role of one who taught the people knowledge and who wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes 12:9. So he defines himself as a writer of Proverbs and one who is teaching knowledge. That corresponds with whom? With Solomon. All points to Solomon, the son of David, as the author. So there we have John MacArthur's Study Bible commentary, and he goes on throughout his whole commentary to bring the narrative in. And as you'll see in a minute, I'm going to put some great clips on from Gary Hamrick and others, that a lot of things are going to fall apart if we have a Solomonic author, someone outside there, a substitute, a JV player, if you will, on this whole thing, because Solomon wasn't the JV player of searching out everything. He was a beast, MVP of this all. And so he is clearly who is being spoken about here. Next, I'd like to point out to you that Rabbinic tradition identifies the author of Ecclesiastes as King Solomon. He wrote it as a reflection of his life. So it also goes on to say that it's further reinforced by Talmudic tradition that Solomon wrote Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes at different stages in his life. Song of Solomon, beginning of life, Proverbs toward the middle, Ecclesiastes is toward the end, looking back. So like me, some gray hair, right? So Talmudic tradition, rabbinic tradition, and the overwhelming evangelical view, to the degree, kind of like when we looked at the book of Ruth on some of those different interpretations, it's pretty clear that the evangelical classical Christian community follows the authorship of Ecclesiastes, being Solomon. So at this point, what I'd like to do is play for you a clip.
If you were reading this in a Hebrew Bible, which is the original language of the Old Testament, this book is called Kohelet. Kohelet, meaning, again, teacher or preacher. Now, the teacher or preacher of this book is the one who was inspired by God to write this. And this ends up being a reflection of his own life. The one writing this is writing from personal experience and being inspired by the Lord. So exactly who is this person? Well, his name is not given to us anywhere in this particular book, but we can understand who he is by looking at how he describes his identity. If you'll notice the latter part of verse 1, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, there was only one son of David who ever ruled as king in Jerusalem, and that was his son Solomon. So Solomon is the one inspired by the Lord to write this. This is somewhat his journal. This is somewhat of a sermon that he's writing from personal life experience. And as he writes this, he writes it as a testimony of the latter years of his life. Now, Solomon is the one who wrote 3 books of the Bible: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And those 3 books are arranged in that order in our Bibles: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs. But they are not really in the order in which they were written. Most Bible scholars believe that Solomon wrote Proverbs early in his life, giving all this wisdom while he was still young. And he wrote Ecclesiastes at the end of his life, and he wrote Song of Songs or Song of Solomon in the middle of his life. Because when you look at how Ecclesiastes unfolds, you'll notice that this is basically a guy who's looking at life in the rearview mirror. And he's writing with a lot of regret. He's looking at his life, and he's looking at the conditions of his life, and he's looking at the fruit of his life, and he's looking at life experience, life success, life challenges, life randomness, all these various aspects of life, and he's looking at life in the rearview mirror, and he writes Ecclesiastes. He's basically going to say, I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, lived my life to its fullest, and yet I was empty. Lived life to the fullest, and yet I was empty. I mean, this is the diary of thousands of people. People who live life to the fullest, and yet they get to some point in their life and they realize, I've done all this, I've experienced all this, I've accomplished all this. Why do I feel so empty? Now, it might be curious for you, because when you think, well, okay, that might be a normal thing that people think, but why would Solomon think this? I mean, he's the king of Israel. He follows the succession from his father, King David. Why, of all people, would King Solomon write like this at the end of his life, being rather disillusioned with life, being rather jaded about life and cynical about life? Well, there's a background story to that I'll get into in a minute, because I don't think that we can appreciate Ecclesiastes unless we first understand the life of Solomon leading up to why he writes the way he does in this final book of his life.
So you notice there with Gary Hamrick, he's from Leesburg, Virginia. We lived in Washington, D.C. for about 4 years, and he was a partner church, his church, big church. They have a huge following with the church we went to, Reston Bible Church. And so very, very solid preacher. You'll notice when he was talking about Solomon, he mentioned that it clearly ties the whole narrative of Ecclesiastes together. He actually made a couple of statements like that. But just wanted to point out that the name Solomon is actually not mentioned in the book, but it's all over the place. And I believe this is another test of maturity. I never thought, like I said, this would be a question until this became a hot topic. And I believe it's very important. It's like many of the narratives, if you read, for example, many Old Testament narratives, just the narrative itself defends itself. It's so clear. And I believe also the 3 points that have been brought up about the Son of David, King of Jerusalem, deliverer of wisdom and knowledge. And the other point here of the odyssey that his life went through, who else was like King Solomon with gold and silver and horses and wives and pleasures and everything. So very important question, and really want to challenge you millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, I'm a Gen Xer, that we bring all the generational stuff together and say, okay, first and foremost, we're going to do good hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of interpretation. What does it say? What does it mean? What's it mean to me? And exegesis, letting the Bible interpret for us what it means, not us superimposing some new novel idea on top of it. That's why I would like to conclude this podcast by encouraging each of you, read the book of Ecclesiastes. As we get into God's word, he's teaching us, and let us humble our hearts before that. I hope this has been encouragement to you. I hope this has been uplifting. I know it has been for me to share it.